We've looked so far at copying and exporting groups as a means of combining instruments, and this is a nice way of combining elements of different factory presets, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't create the whole picture or recreate the whole picture. Yes, all the group-based parameter values and settings are translated, but there are other instrument-wide settings that may not be, like modulation routings and insert and effects chains, for example. Now, in the instrument we created in the last video, in that example, the mod wheel routings don't play nicely with the imported pad groups. So you got to be careful when you're importing and exporting these different elements to combine together. So groups are just one of the building blocks that can be exported and reused in these instrument creations. And I'm a big fan of reusing these. I like to think of them as building blocks. Effects chains are another element that can be repurposed. And as an exercise, let's try and deconstruct and then rebuild this hybrid instrument from scratch as a means of understanding how to export and import the different components and how they can fit together in new instruments. Now, here's the initial Mark II phaser ballad preset that we started with. And one of the things I like about this, it's even in the name, is that it's got a phaser in it. So meaning it has some nice effects processing. And also there's some nice panning modulation on the mod wheel. For example, and again, you can watch my mod wheel movement here. You'll hear as I play it. So let's look at what's going on here and export what we need to reuse. So I'm going to go into edit mode. Now in the groups editor, I've already renamed these two groups with roads in the front of the name, and I've already exported them. You've seen me do that. You don't need to see that again. But let's look at what else is going on here. In the insert effects, we've got a whole series of effects processes going on, and that's obviously contributing to the sound of this instrument. So we can look in the preset menu here and we see there's a bunch of factory preset chains, and I'm not sure if this is one of them or if it's been customized. So what I want to do is save it so that I can reuse it, not only in this instrument I'm going to build now, but maybe in some future instruments. It's a nice effects chain that's good for this kind of phaser ballad type of sound. Who knows, it might work nicely on a synth sound or a guitar sound. We don't know. So I'm going to save it, and let's look at where it defaults to saving it to. We're in the documents folder of my specific user, native instruments, contact 5, presets, effects chain, inserts, and then there's send effects chains as well. So they're over here, and I'm going to name this. And now we'll have it in the preset menu under user. There's what I just exported. Now let's look at the send effects, and there we have reverb and delay, which are also going to be contributing to what makes this preset what it is. So same thing, I'm going to go to save preset, and it's pointing me to the related folder in that directory. And there it'll be available there now. So I can reuse it, not only in the instrument I'm making now, but in the future. Okay, so I think we've harvested everything we need to from here. There's some nice modulation routing for the panning, but we're going to recreate that from scratch. So let's get rid of this, and I'm going to create a new empty instrument, and we'll go into edit mode, and the group editor, there's just one empty group. You see in the mapping editor, there's nothing in it. So let's start by bringing in our groups, and we'll start by bringing in these roads groups, and I've got them saved over here. Here's the sustain, and now let's bring in the release group, and let's turn off edit all groups, and let's hear what we have so far. So we have those roads mappings in place, and again, because we're at the group in, we don't need to deal with the mapping editor. They're already mapped out with the velocity splits, and all that's been saved, and it's nice. But let's start bringing in the other elements. Let me close this up just so we can see an overview of what's happening here. Let's go to the insert effects and bring in the preset we saved. There it is, and let's do the same thing with the send effects, and we should be a lot closer now. So that's sounding nice, but we still don't have our modulation routing. So let's set that up. I'm going to close this up just so we can see more clearly what and where we're working. And I'm going to add this into the amp envelope. We're going to add or create a modulation routing. So here, since this is group specific, we need to make sure we're operating on the right group, and the Rhodes sustain is the one I want to work with. So I'm going to go to the modulation router in the amplifier section. This is what we use to make the connections between modulation targets and sources, and I'll click on it, and we see here that we've already got a sine wave brought in to modulate the panning that was saved with the group. So half the work's done for us. All we really need to do is modulate this intensity slider with the mod wheel. So if I hold some notes down and move this, you can hear the panning. So if I right click there and go learn CC automation, move my mod wheel, we can now do it the way we were doing it in the previous patch with the mod wheel. Or we could recreate it from scratch. It's not that complex to do. I'm just going to select it and delete it. And what we'll do now is create a new modulator, and we'll use a sine wave LFO, and we'll route it to panning. And I'll right click here and just remove the modulation and then relearn it again. And it may not be the same speed. Let's listen. Yeah, I think we want it a bit faster, and you can see the target value moving there. So we can use this quick jump button over here to jump to the modulation section, and it automatically selects that modulation source for us, which is the LFO. And here's the speed. We can make it a bit faster. It'll be somewhere around there will work. And of course, we can modify it further. We could change the shape if we want to try a triangle or sawtooth or anything else. But sine is nice and smooth for panning. So now I need to bring in the rest of the groups and set up the key switches. And I'll do that on my own. You don't need to watch me do it again. You've seen it done in the last video. I'll just bring in the first two here, a bird and fragile. And I'll set these up with the key switches, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've got a bird assigned to key switch C-1 and fragile the same one, and then these two to D. And I've used this default group that was created with this new instrument for the silent or dummy group to bring it back to just the piano. And I've done some interesting modifications here to improve it a bit. So on a bird, I added a modulation routing for an LFO to modulate the panning as well and assign the mod wheel, but I assigned it at a faster rate. You can see here I put it at 3.3 hertz. We can do this to tempo, but I don't think it's necessary for this type of panning modulation. So let's make sure we have the right key group, and let's listen to that. So there we have different types of panning speeds for different elements in this layer. And now that I'm playing them together, I think I want to decrease the release envelope of this a bird group. It's fairly long here. Let's lower that, maybe somewhere around there. Let's try that again. So yeah, that dies away more naturally. And maybe I'll decrease the release time as well in this other group that's involved with this same key switch. And we can see here that's long as well. Let's try that. So yeah, they die way more naturally. So you can adjust these obviously to taste. So the idea I'm trying to get across to you here in these first few videos is that we can save, export, and repurpose different components or modules or elements, however you want to think of it, of the factory instruments, and repurpose them and recombine them in interesting ways, namely groups involving their note mapping setups and their different modulation routings and envelope setups. We can export those, effects chains, instrument chains. We can recreate some interesting modulation ideas without too much difficulty. These are all ways to get the most out of the factory library. I'm going to end off here, and we'll move on with some new material in the next video.